A strange visitor at Baker Street ***it was on a gray and mist-laden morning in early November that a peculiarity of circumstance presented itself at our usually tranquil quarters at 221B Baker Street. I had been engaged in the rather ordinary task of cataloging my medical notes when the unmistakable ring of the bell announced a visitor of some urgency. Holmes, as ever, had been absorbed in his chemical experiments, his long, sinewy fingers carefully manipulating a delicate array of reagents, and he barely glanced up as I opened the door. The visitor who stood upon our threshold was a woman whose age it would have been impolite to specify. Yet one could discern the weariness of prolonged anxiety etched upon her features. She was elegantly dressed, though the costume bespoke haste rather than careful preparation. Her gloves, while fine, bore traces of soil, and the faintest smudge of ink marred her otherwise meticulous handkerchief. It was evident that she had traveled in some haste through the damp, fog-bound streets. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. I am in desperate need of your assistance. Scotland Yard has examined the matter, but they cannot will not offer any explanation that makes sense. You are said to be different." Holmes, who had now set aside his beakers, regarded her with his habitual intensity. "Madam," he said, in that clipped and measured tone which can so often startle those unaccustomed to it, "pray take a seat. Mr. Watson, a cup of tea if you would. We shall require it." The woman sank into the chair opposite our fireplace, wringing her gloves as though they could absorb the disquiet that occupied her thoughts. "I am Miss Eleanor Faraday," she began, "and the matter concerns my family home in Bloomsbury. Something unnatural has been occurring. Doors close upon themselves, objects are displaced without cause, and last night—" She paused, swallowing a quivering breath. "Last night, my cousin nearly fell victim to a most alarming incident. The door of his study closed suddenly, with such force that he could scarcely recover his balance. No wind, no mechanism, no explanation that I can conceive could account for it. Yet the lock bore no sign of tampering, and the windows were secured." Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "Doors that close themselves, you say? And yet no evidence of manipulation, no drafts, no intrusions detectable by ordinary means." Miss Faraday nodded, her large eyes reflecting both fear and relief at finding someone who might comprehend her plight. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, this is not the sort of thing one fabricates. Scotland Yard suspects nothing more than an overactive imagination or a mechanical quirk. Yet I have witnessed the occurrences myself. My cousin, Henry Faraday, is a man of considerable composure and reason, yet even he is at a loss. He fears for his safety. I fear for his life, and indeed for our own sanity." Holmes made no immediate reply. Instead, he turned his gaze toward me. The corners of his mouth quirked ever so slightly in that sardonic manner that often precedes a particularly extraordinary deduction. "Watson," he said, "observe the visitor closely. Her gait, her posture, the subtle tremor in the fingers, the manner in which she arranges her skirts upon sitting, these are all indicative of acute distress. Certainly, but more importantly, they betray a remarkable attention to detail. Note also the ink smudge on her glove. One would surmise that she has recently examined documents or written in haste. Finally, the soil peat and loam, if I am not mistaken, suggests travel through damp gardens or unpaved paths. All of these observations, considered together, speak to a woman both careful and genuine, whose account merits our fullest attention." I could not help but feel a rush of admiration for Holmes' almost preternatural perception. Miss Faraday, for her part, seemed reassured, though she remained visibly nervous. "Do you believe me?" she asked, her voice quiet but earnest. Holmes inclined his head in a manner both decisive and enigmatic. "I do not deal in belief, madam. I deal in belief, madam. I deal in observation and deduction. Your account is coherent, detailed, and corroborated by the evidence you have provided, physical and otherwise. Therefore, we shall examine the matter. Tell me, if you please, all occurrences in chronological order, without omission, no matter how trivial they may seem." Miss Faraday nodded, her hands now resting calmly in her lap, though the pallor of her skin revealed the strain under which she had labored. She began, haltingly at first, recounting the events of the previous weeks. Doors closing inexplicably, windows found ajar in the early morning hours, the subtle displacement of objects on mantels and shelves. At one point, she had noticed a small silver key left upon the floor, though its purpose or origin was wholly unknown. Holmes' eyes brightened at this, though he offered no comment. Instead, He listened with that intense concentration which transforms the ordinary act of hearing into a kind of exact science. "I admit," Miss Faraday concluded, "that I cannot fathom how any ordinary person could accomplish these feats. They seem deliberate, almost as though someone wished to unnerve us, or perhaps to convey a message. Yet no message is left, no demand, no theft, only the door that closes itself." Holmes, after a prolonged silence, leaned forward suddenly, steepling his fingers again and regarding her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to strip one of all pretense. "Madam, one cannot determine the cause of events such as these without direct examination. I shall require that you provide access to the house at the earliest opportunity. There are subtle traces, impressions, mechanisms, air currents, and the minutiae of domestic life which must be observed firsthand. Watson, I presume you will accompany me?" I nodded, heart quickened by anticipation. There was an urgency in Holmes' demeanor that bespoke both the intrigue of the case and the intellectual challenge it presented. "Certainly, Holmes. I shall be at your side." Miss Faraday looked between us, relief mingled with lingering anxiety. "You will come this afternoon. I shall make all preparations. My cousin Henry is most anxious to avoid further incidents, yet he trusts your judgment implicitly." Holmes inclined his head, gathering his coat and walking stick. "We shall arrive, madam, and rest assured, the matter shall be investigated thoroughly. Whatever the cause natural or otherwise shall be uncovered." As the visitor departed, her skirts brushing against the damp pavement, I turned to Holmes. "You believe there is more here than mere wind or accident, do you not?" Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes, ever sharp, were fixed upon the faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, or perhaps upon some pattern invisible to ordinary observers. At length he spoke, his voice low and precise. "Watson, the simplest explanation is rarely the correct one when human intention is involved. And this door that closes itself may be no simple matter. Observe, consider, and above all, do not allow the ordinary to cloud the extraordinary. We are on the threshold of a puzzle, Watson, a puzzle which, I assure you, will be most intriguing." And with that, he returned to his chemical experiments, the faint smell of ether and reagents filling the room, while I sat back and contemplated the events yet to come. The fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street, as if London itself awaited the revelation that Holmes alone could bring. Thus began, on a grey November morning, the case of the door that closed itself, a case which promised not only intellectual challenge, but also the peculiar disquiet that accompanies mysteries where the ordinary and the extraordinary intertwine. Holmes at work *** that afternoon, the fog had lifted only marginally, leaving the streets of London glistening with recent rain, while a damp chill clung to the air. Holmes and I took a cab from Baker Street to Bloomsbury, Miss Faraday's carriage awaiting our arrival near the corner of Russell Square. The city, despite its apparent serenity, exuded a tension beneath the mundane clatter of cab wheels and the occasional shout of a street vendor. Holmes, as ever, was entirely absorbed in his observations. The pavements, the slight asymmetry in the alignment of nearby lampposts, and even the manner in which the cabman held his reins. To an ordinary eye, these details might have seemed trivial, yet I knew that each played into the calculations and deductions that perpetually occupied his mind. Upon reaching the Faraday residence, we were met by Henry Faraday himself, a tall, slender man whose normally calm composure was betrayed by the taut lines of his jaw and the occasional nervous glance toward the front door of his study. He offered a courteous greeting but seemed barely able to conceal his apprehension. Miss Eleanor Faraday, appearing calmer than her cousin but no less vigilant, led us into the drawing room where the scene of the disturbances had most recently manifested. Holmes, without preamble, began his inspection. He first examined the door that had caused the alarm, noting its hinges, the alignment of the frame, and the locking mechanism. He tapped lightly at the edges, his sharp ear registering subtle echoes and irregularities. "Watson," he whispered, "observe the wear along the lower edge of the door. There is slight chafing, indicative not of wind or accidental contact, but repeated, deliberate application of force. Note also the lock undisturbed, yet the latch bears an unusual pattern of friction." I leaned forward, examining the door as Holmes instructed. The chafing was barely perceptible, yet, under his guidance, I could discern that it followed a distinct vertical line, as though something or someone had interacted with the door in a precise manner. Holmes' eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity, betraying both excitement and concentration. Holmes next turned his attention to the floor, running his fingers along the threshold. And here, Watson, the floorboards themselves tell a story. Minute scratches, subtle depressions in the polish, these mark the passage of weight, yet the spacing is irregular. One might assume accidental movement, yet the repetition of these traces suggests deliberate, cautious positioning. Henry Faraday, observing us closely, interjected with an anxious frown. You believe, then, that someone has been attempting to manipulate the door deliberately? Holmes inclined his head without answering immediately. Instead, he examined the windows of the study, noting the small catches and fastenings. Security has been maintained, he observed. No ordinary intruder could have entered unnoticed, yet the disturbances persist. This is not a simple mechanical fault, nor a trick of the wind. Something or someone has created the illusion of autonomy. Miss Faraday shivered slightly. But how, Mr. Holmes? We have checked the doors ourselves, secured the windows, and yet the door? It closes as if by will. My cousin nearly fell yesterday when it shut with such force. Holmes gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that suggested both amusement and approval. The phenomenon, madam, is indeed perplexing, yet it shall yield to careful scrutiny. Observe, Watson, how the human mind can construct fear when confronted by patterns it cannot immediately understand. Our task is to discern what is truly operative beneath the apparent supernatural. We then examined the room itself. Holmes measured the distance between furniture and door, observed the arrangement of rugs, and even noted the subtle undulations of the wooden floor, likely caused by variations in moisture. Watson, he said, all of these details, however mundane they may seem, form a matrix of potential clues. One must consider airflow, pivot points, mechanical leverage, and most importantly the human element. It is never merely chance. Holmes' attention next turned to the silver key Miss Faraday had mentioned, which lay upon the mantelpiece. He picked it up with delicate precision, inspecting it through a jeweler's loupe. An object of some importance, he murmured. Notice the wear upon the edges, Watson. It has been used frequently, yet with caution. The pattern of scratches suggests repeated insertion and removal from a lock, likely of a domestic nature. Not uncommon, yet potentially significant. He placed the key into a small envelope, sealing it carefully. We shall return to this after further observation. For now, the door itself and its environment demand immediate attention. Let us reconstruct the series of events in chronological order. Who was present, and at what times? What movements occurred prior to the incidents? Miss Faraday recounted the previous week's disturbances in meticulous detail. Holmes, listening intently, occasionally interrupted to clarify minor inconsistencies in timing or action. I noted that his questions were not merely inquisitive, they were designed to reveal underlying patterns, to expose those subtle deviations from routine that ordinary observers would overlook. Watson, he said finally, after a prolonged silence, observe the timing of the incidents. Each occurs when the room is vacated for a brief interval, never during prolonged occupation. Each disturbance is subtle, yet perceptible. Each is perfectly calculated to instill unease, yet leaves no overt sign of intrusion. The person responsible possesses patience, dexterity, and a detailed knowledge of domestic patterns. I felt a chill as his words sank in. So you think it is deliberate to human hand, not mere chance? Holmes nodded slowly. Precisely. We are dealing not with mechanical failure, nor with the caprice of weather, but with intention. Someone has sought to create the illusion of a door that closes itself. The question, Watson, is why and how? He paused for a moment, eyes distant yet sharply focused, as though measuring an invisible web stretching through the room. We shall remain tonight in the house, he continued, observe from vantage points, and conduct tests under controlled conditions. Only by direct observation can we discern the mechanics behind this mystery. And you, my dear Watson, shall record everything in precise detail, for even the smallest deviation from expectation may prove critical. Miss Faraday, though anxious, agreed to our presence, and her cousin Henry seemed relieved that action was finally being taken. As evening approached, Holmes and I settled ourselves within the study, arranging discrete observation points and noting every aspect of the room. The doors, windows, furnishings, floor, and ceiling. Holmes instructed me to maintain careful notes of sound, air movement, and minute visual cues, emphasizing that no detail was too small. And so, as the lamps cast a soft glow upon the study, and the fog pressed against the windows in silvery tendrils, we began the first night of surveillance. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards or the soft ticking of the mantel clock. And yet, even in this stillness, I could feel the tension, the watchful anticipation, and the unmistakable presence of a mystery that promised to test both our wits and our nerve. Holmes, seated quietly in his corner, eyes sharp and mind alert, whispered only once, "Watson, the extraordinary is often disguised as the ordinary. Attend carefully, and you shall see what others cannot." And with that, we waited, knowing that the first clues of the mystery of the door that closed itself would reveal themselves under the patient gaze of Sherlock Holmes. The first night of observation ****, the evening had settled over Bloomsbury with a damp, oppressive stillness, and the fog lay thick upon the streets, curling about lampposts like spectral tendrils. Inside the Faraday residence, the study had been prepared as our observation post. Holmes had chosen the most unobtrusive corner, a position from which he could watch the door, the windows, and the entire room, while remaining shielded from the casual notice of anyone entering. I took my place in an armchair opposite him, notebook in hand, ready to chronicle the unfolding events with meticulous care. Henry Faraday, anxious yet resolute, had retired to an adjoining room, while Miss Eleanor Faraday lingered briefly to express her gratitude, her hands wringing a handkerchief in nervous rhythm. Holmes gave her a slight nod and murmured, "Your presence is appreciated, madam, but observe from a distance. We require an uninterrupted study of the environment." She complied, retreating quietly to her own chamber, leaving us in the hush of the room. Hours passed with the monotony of waiting, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional creak of floorboards as the house settled. The fire in the grate cast flickering shadows upon the walls, lending the room an atmosphere at once cozy and uncanny. Holmes, as I observed, made no attempt at idle conversation. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, studied every inch of the room with methodical precision. "It is often in stillness, Watson," he said quietly, "that the mind can perceive subtleties which escape notice in action. Observe the patterns of light, the slight drafts from the window, the imperceptible movements of air. All these factors, however trivial they seem, may betray the origin of the disturbances you have described." I noted his words carefully, recording even the smallest observations. The flutter of a curtain by a gentle breeze, the minute shift of the rug near the door, and the faint creak of the floorboards under the weight of the empty room. Every sound, every movement seemed significant when filtered through the lens of Holmes' scrutiny. At precisely 11 o'clock, I perceived a subtle change in the room. A draft, scarcely perceptible, whispered across the floor, and the door, which had remained motionless for hours, shifted slightly in its frame. I whispered to Holmes, who merely inclined his head, his gaze sharpening with sudden intensity. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The door has moved, yet no hand is visible. Mark the time and manner of the movement. There is significance here, though its source remains elusive." I made careful notes, recording the slight rocking of the door and the absence of any discernible external cause. Holmes leaned forward, examining the threshold with the keen eyes of a man who reads every nuance in the physical world. "There," he whispered, tapping lightly on the floorboards, "the faintest depression. Someone has applied weight, yet not in the obvious manner. Consider leverage, Watson, and the possible use of implements. Observe carefully. Everything has its reason." Minutes stretched into an hour, and the door remained mostly still, save for occasional, imperceptible tremors. Holmes continued to observe, occasionally lifting his eyes toward the window or the ceiling, as if anticipating the next subtle manifestation. I, in my turn, noted each movement, each sound, and each flicker of light, aware that the smallest detail could prove crucial. Suddenly, at 12:30, a more pronounced motion occurred. The door swung inward with a soft click, almost silent yet distinct. I started, but Holmes merely raised a finger, signaling me to remain still. "Note, Watson," he said, "the sound. All are indicators of the method employed. Observe, but do not interfere." We remained in silence for several tense minutes, the door stationary yet suggestive of the invisible force that seemed to act upon it. Holmes examined the hinges, the frame, and the latch, muttering observations under his breath. Friction minimal, movement consistent with light leverage, slight imbalance of weight, intentional, yet disguised as random. Curious. I leaned closer, unable to restrain a whispered question. "Holmes, do you suspect a mechanical contrivance? Or perhaps some concealed device within the door?" He shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the threshold. "Not mechanical in the conventional sense. The method is subtle, almost ingenious. Observe the pattern of occurrences. They coincide with brief absences, moments when the room is unoccupied. Whoever orchestrates this understands both timing and human perception. We are dealing with a mind, Watson, not mere chance. We remain thus for the remainder of the night, our vigilance absolute. At intervals, the door moved, shifting almost imperceptibly, yet always in a manner consistent with Holmes' emerging deductions. No sound of tampering or external interference was detected. The movements were deliberate, controlled, and calculated to evoke unease. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the misted windows, Holmes allowed himself a small, satisfied sigh. Watson, the night has been instructive. Observe the consistency of the movements, their subtlety, and the absolute precision of execution. Our intruder is not careless, nor are they indifferent to observation. Each act is designed to provoke fear while leaving minimal trace. I felt a chill as I realized the implications. The person responsible was clever, patient, and intimately familiar with the house and its routines. "Holmes," I said quietly, this door is a masterful instrument of misdirection. But who could possess such skill and daring?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose, stretching his long limbs with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator surveying his environment. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we shall discover. And it is why our observations tonight are invaluable. Each motion, each nuance, each seemingly trivial detail will contribute to the ultimate revelation." He paused at the window, gazing toward the misted streets below. "Observe, Watson, how the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary. The human mind is adept at creating patterns where none exist, yet also prone to overlook the subtle threads that reveal truth. It is our duty to follow those threads, however faint, until the entire tapestry is revealed." As the light grew stronger, the door settled into apparent stillness, as though content to rest after a night of clandestine activity. Holmes, satisfied for the moment, directed me to prepare a summary of our observations, emphasizing precision and detail. "Watson, tomorrow we shall expand our investigation, examine other points of access, and perhaps introduce controlled tests to provoke response. The mystery of the self-closing door is only beginning to yield its secrets." I felt both excitement and trepidation. The night had confirmed Holmes' suspicions. The disturbances were deliberate, subtle, and highly calculated. We were no longer merely observers of unexplained phenomena. We were participants in a challenge of intellect and perception, tasked with unveiling the method and motive behind this enigmatic intrusion. As Holmes finally allowed himself a moment of repose, the first rays of November sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the study in pale gold. I, too, relaxed slightly, recording the final observations of the night. The door remained still, yet I knew that each silent creak, each imperceptible shift, had been a message, one that only Holmes, with his unparalleled powers of deduction, could interpret. Thus concluded the first night of surveillance, a night in which the ordinary was revealed as extraordinary, and the subtle artistry of fear and misdirection began to take shape under the unerring scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes. A logical suspect emerges **** the following morning. Bloomsbury was shrouded in mist, as though the city itself were conspiring with the enigma that haunted the Faraday residence. Holmes and I returned at an early hour, determined to expand our observations and investigate avenues that the previous night's vigil had suggested. The events of the prior evening had provided much food for reflection. The precise, deliberate movements of the door, the subtle depressions in the floor, and the uncanny absence of any overt mechanism. Holmes, as ever, wasted no time in inspecting the study upon our arrival. "Watson," he said in that deliberate, measured tone which often prefaced his deductions, "the most remarkable aspect of this phenomenon is the attention to timing. Note that the door's movements coincide with brief absences. This indicates knowledge not merely of mechanics but of routine. Someone is observing the household with care, familiarity, and patience." I followed his gaze as he examined the hinges, the floorboards, and the arrangement of furniture with meticulous scrutiny. "So you believe the intruder is someone known to the family?" I asked, a thought that had been lingering since our first observations. Holmes inclined his head slowly. "It is the most rational hypothesis, Watson. A stranger would be unlikely to possess such intimate knowledge of the layout, the floorboards, and the habits of the occupants. The pattern of disturbances suggests a familiarity that extends beyond casual acquaintance." Our examination was interrupted by the arrival of the local constable, Mr. Briggs, who had been summoned by Miss Faraday in hopes that a police presence might lend some reassurance. Briggs, a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Morning, Mr. Holmes," he said, glancing at the study. "I've been trying to make sense of Miss Faraday's account, but I must admit it baffles me. Doors closing themselves, objects shifting. I've examined the room, and I see nothing untoward. Some of the neighbors suggest it might be supernatural." Holmes raised a single eyebrow, his gaze icy yet faintly amused. "Supernatural, you say, Mr. Briggs? Let us rely on observation rather than fancy. Superstition has never solved a case in London." Briggs nodded, though with visible reluctance, and recounted minor complaints from the neighbors. Odd noises, glimpses of shadows moving in unoccupied rooms, and the occasional unexplained creak of floorboards. Holmes listened attentively, taking notes with a precision that made even the constable's careful words appear trivial by comparison. After the constable's departure, Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of calculation. "Watson, the simplest explanation, grounded in probability, is often overlooked. Consider, who within this household door among its immediate acquaintances possesses both access and motive to orchestrate such disturbances?" I pondered, listing the household members in my mind. The Faradays themselves were above suspicion, as was the maid, a young woman of sterling character. Holmes' eyes, however, betrayed an inward excitement, as though he had already identified the thread that others might miss. It was shortly thereafter that our first suspect emerged not through speculation, but through deliberate observation and inquiry. The Faradays' gardener, a man named Samuel Henshaw, was introduced to us under the pretext of routine maintenance. Holmes had noted subtle traces of soil, slightly damp, near the front entrance the night before peat and loam that seemed inconsistent with mere street travel. The gardener, tall and wiry, with hands that bore the faintest ink stains, immediately drew Holmes' attention. "Watson," he whispered, barely audible, "observe the man's hands. Note the soil, the scratches, and the ink. There is knowledge here and intimacy with both the house and its operations that cannot be acquired in a day. Yet there is something hesitant in his manner, a subtle attempt to conceal familiarity with certain tools and mechanisms." I studied the man carefully, noting what Holmes had indicated. The faint traces of ink on the fingers, the slight wear on the fingernails consistent with careful manual labor, and the occasional glance toward the study door that betrayed both awareness and apprehension. Holmes beckoned Henshaw closer under the guise of routine inquiry. "Mr. Henshaw," he said, in his deliberate, penetrating tone, "you have been employed at the Faraday residence for some years, have you not?" "Yes, sir," replied the gardener, his voice steady though tinged with slight unease. "And you are familiar with the movements of the household, the arrangement of furniture, and the doors, I presume?" "Certainly, sir. It is part of my duties." Holmes' gaze narrowed. "And yet, Mr. Henshaw, would it be within the realm of possibility for someone with your intimate knowledge of the house to create an appearance of a door closing by itself, perhaps using subtle tools, timing, or leverage?" The man's eyes widened imperceptibly, and for a brief instant his composure faltered. He stammered, "I see. I cannot conceive why anyone would do such a thing, sir. It seems impossible." Holmes did not press further immediately, though I noticed the faint tension in his posture. "It is merely a theoretical question, Mr. Henshaw. But note, Watson, how a trained mind discerns hesitation. Even the most practiced actor leaves a trace of truth in manner, in inflection, in the alignment of posture. Our gardener has knowledge, yet his reaction reveals more than he intends." We spent the remainder of the day discreetly observing Henshaw as he went about his duties. Holmes noted his habits, the manner in which he adjusted the garden tools, the careful placement of his boots upon certain areas of the stone pathway, and, most crucially, his glances toward the study door when he thought himself unobserved. Each of these subtle movements Holmes catalogued with meticulous care, his eyes lighting with that rare sparkle which, I had learned, always presaged a revelation. By evening, Holmes had formed a preliminary, yet remarkably confident, assessment. "Watson," he said, pacing the room with long, deliberate strides, "our gardener is not merely a suspect by chance. He possesses motive, opportunity, and knowledge. Yet we must exercise caution. The apparent evidence can mislead the unwary. We require further observation and, if necessary, controlled provocation to confirm the hypothesis." I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The first suspect had emerged, not through rumor or speculation, but by careful scrutiny, subtle observation, and the unerring logic of Sherlock Holmes. Yet I also sensed the latent complexity of the case. Henshaw's knowledge and hesitancy suggested a mind at play, and the possibility of misdirection loomed as we prepared for the nights ahead. Holmes, ever methodical, concluded the day's work with a brief summary. We have established that the disturbances are deliberate, precise, and designed to manipulate perception. Our first suspect is a man familiar with the household whose actions reveal subtle traces of intent. Tomorrow we shall observe under controlled conditions, introduce measures to test reaction, and refine our understanding of both method and motive. Only then can we approach certainty. As I retired for the night, notebook in hand, I reflected upon the emergence of our first suspect. The thrill of deduction, the promise of revelation, and the subtle tension that accompanies each new lead combined to create an atmosphere of both excitement and foreboding. The mystery of the door that closed itself had, at last, begun to take tangible form. The hidden clue **** the day following our initial observations of Mr. Samuel Henshaw dawned gray and misty, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into both bones and spirits. Holmes, however, appeared entirely undisturbed by the weather. In fact, I noticed a rare spark in his eyes that suggested he had already begun to trace patterns invisible to the ordinary observer. He remained in the study with me as I prepared our notes from the previous night, his gaze flicking repeatedly between the door, the window, and the small collection of implements arranged neatly on the mantelpiece. "Watson," he said at length, his voice calm but charged with subtle intensity, "it is remarkable how the human mind perceives the obvious, yet overlooks the inconspicuous. Our gardener, whom we identified yesterday, may appear the prime suspect, yet I am wary of premature conclusions. Observe, the simplest explanation is rarely the correct one when human intent is involved." I glanced up at him, noting the deliberate emphasis he placed on human intent. "You do not think Henshaw is the culprit?" I asked cautiously. Holmes inclined his head slightly, though his eyes did not leave the door. "Not necessarily, Watson. He possesses knowledge of the household and opportunity, yes, but these facts alone do not establish guilt. There is a detail, hidden in plain sight, which I have yet to disclose to you. Consider it a challenge of observation and inference." My curiosity piqued. I leaned closer. "A hidden clue, Holmes? Then let us examine the room once more. Perhaps there is a subtle mark, a misplaced object, a pattern in the floorboards we have overlooked." Holmes smiled faintly, the smile that always preceded his most extraordinary deductions. "Precisely, my dear Watson. Yet you must observe without the filter of assumption. Allow the evidence to speak, rather than imposing expectation upon it." We began another meticulous survey of the study. I noted once more the subtle depressions in the floor, the arrangement of furniture, the faint scratches along the threshold of the door, and the pattern of light that fell through the window as the overcast morning filtered weakly into the room. Holmes, meanwhile, appeared entirely absorbed in the minutiae of the door itself. He touched the wood with an almost reverent delicacy, inspected the hinges, and then crouched to study the floorboards near the corner of the room. "Watson," he said after several long minutes of silence, "observe here." He pointed to a barely perceptible mark in the wood, a tiny nick not visible without close inspection. "Notice the angle and depth of the indentation. It is inconsistent with accidental contact, yet is too faint to be observed casually. The direction of pressure indicates a mechanism applied obliquely levered, yet disguised. Our gardener would hardly be able to produce such precise work with bare hands alone." I bent closer, my attention sharpened. Indeed, the indentation was subtle, nearly invisible, yet Holmes' explanation made its significance unmistakable. "So you believe someone has manipulated a device or contrivance to act upon the door?" I asked. Holmes nodded, his expression as precise and sharp as the instruments he often employed in his experiments. "Yes, Watson. The device itself is minute, ingeniously applied, and likely portable. It can be placed, activated, and removed with ease. This is why our observations last night detected no overt interference, no mechanical tampering in the conventional sense. It is the work of a cunning mind, and not of Mr. Henshaw alone, though he may be an unwitting accomplice or observer." I felt a thrill of understanding, coupled with a mild sense of disquiet. The implication was clear. Our gardener might be falsely suspected or even manipulated into unwittingly aiding a more subtle hand. The true architect of these disturbances remained at large, and his cunning was sufficient to evade ordinary notice. Holmes' attention then turned to the mantelpiece, where the silver key lay in its envelope. He lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. "Watson, note the wear on the teeth of the key. It has been inserted repeatedly into a lock of some sophistication. Yet the lock in question need not be the door itself. Consider, What other entryways, compartments, or devices within this household might accommodate such a key? I examined the envelope and the key, noting the subtle scratches along its surface, the slight misalignment of its notches. A cabinet perhaps, or a hidden compartment? I suggested. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Precisely. And such a compartment, unknown to the casual observer, might conceal both motive and means. Our intruder's intention, Watson, is as much to bewilder as to conceal. The door is merely the stage upon which a deeper plan is enacted. Our investigation that day was interrupted by a brief visit from Miss Eleanor Faraday, who brought tea and expressed concern over the prolonged scrutiny of the house. Holmes accepted her presence with polite courtesy but remained absorbed in the minutiae of his observations, noting her reactions to certain objects and the subtle gestures she made while adjusting her shawl. "It is remarkable," he said softly, almost to himself, "how even the presence of observers influences behavior. One must always account for the observer effect when interpreting clues. Note her hesitation near the mantelpiece, Watson. A small detail, yes, but potentially significant. Fear, habit, or knowledge one of these governs her actions." As the afternoon waned, Holmes devised a series of controlled tests to probe the door's behavior and the hidden mechanisms at play. He placed slight weights at calculated positions, observed airflow with a feather, and even positioned a mirror to detect the reflection of any subtle levers or devices. Throughout, he instructed me to record every detail meticulously, emphasizing that the smallest anomaly could yield the key to understanding the intruder's method. By evening, Holmes had assembled a preliminary theory. The disturbances were the product of deliberate human intent, executed with cunning and precision, and likely facilitated by a hidden device or mechanical contrivance. The silver key, the subtle floor depressions, and the odd interactions with the door itself all pointed toward a level of sophistication beyond ordinary domestic mischief. Yet, in true Holmesian fashion, he revealed none of his full conclusions to me. "Patience, Watson," he said as we prepared to leave the house. "The evidence must be allowed to speak fully, unhurriedly, and without interference. Tomorrow, we shall pursue this line further, observe reactions, and test both method and motive. The hidden clue has been noted. It remains for us to see how it integrates with the larger puzzle." As we returned to Baker Street, the fog thickened once more over London, curling around gas lamps and horse-drawn cabs in ghostly wisps. I felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The first pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, yet the ultimate truth remained obscured by layers of subtle deception. The true architect of the self-closing door remained at large, and his ingenuity promised further challenges be fully revealed. Holmes, for his part, appeared unusually contemplative, pacing the room and occasionally making cryptic notations on a slip of paper. "Watson," he said finally, "the simplest, most hidden clue often carries the greatest significance. And in this case, it has revealed itself. Our task now is to observe, to test, and to await the moment when the method is laid bare before us. Until then, we proceed with patience, precision, and vigilance." And so ended the 5th day of our inquiry, a day in which subtle details emerged from obscurity, a preliminary suspect was observed with caution, and a hidden clue suggested the presence of an unseen hand orchestrating the phenomena. The game had grown more intricate, the stakes higher, and the path to truth more labyrinthine than ever. Rising tension **** the following night, I found myself once more in the Faraday study, seated across from Holmes as he prepared his instruments for the second vigil. The evening had brought with it a denser fog than usual, and a fine drizzle painted the gas lamps of Bloomsbury with a muted, trembling glow. The streets were nearly deserted, the occasional hansom cab rumbling past like some distant drumbeat announcing our city's quiet unease. Holmes, as usual, wasted no time on idle conversation. "Watson, the previous night has provided us with valuable observations, but it is clear that the intruder's methods are evolving. The subtle marks, the depressions, and the interaction with the door all point toward intelligence and adaptability. We are no longer merely observers. We are participants in a challenge of perception." I noted his choice of words with some unease, for the sense of being observed had become tangible in the silent, shadowed corners of the study. Every creak of floorboards, every whisper of air through the slightly open window seemed to carry significance. I dared not speak aloud for fear of disturbing Holmes' concentration. Hours passed with the solemnity of a vigil, the shadows lengthening and contracting with the flicker of the fire. Holmes' eyes moved constantly, following patterns invisible to me, yet I endeavored to match his attention with meticulous note-taking. Then, at 11:15, the first notable incident occurred. The study door, which had remained resolutely still for nearly 2 hours, began to shift imperceptibly at first, then with a gradual, deliberate movement that suggested control rather than chance. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowing in calculation. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The movement is consistent with last night, yet faster, more decisive. Someone has refined the method, likely anticipating our vigilance. Note the absence of ordinary manipulation. The door moves as if guided by invisible hands, yet the hidden mechanism we identified yesterday may be at work. Indeed, I could detect a slight, almost imperceptible creaking at the hinge and a subtle pressure upon the threshold." Holmes, as though reading my thoughts, added, "Weight, leverage, and timing, all executed with precision. The intruder is calculating our responses even as we observe. This is no accident. It is deliberate, and it grows more audacious with each night." Minutes passed in tense silence before the second, more alarming incident occurred. A window, previously secured, rattled sharply, and the faint glimmer of a shadow flitted across the study wall. I started forward, but Holmes raised a hand, signaling calm. "Observe, Watson. Fear is the instrument, not the enemy. Note the pattern, the timing, and the angle of interference. The intruder wishes to unnerve, to test our attention, to provoke reaction. We must respond with observation, not panic." The shadow passed, leaving behind only the faintest trace, a small smudge on the windowsill, likely caused by the intruder's hand. Holmes examined it with his loupe, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Watson, a mark at last. Note its composition. Soot, perhaps from the chimney, mixed with a trace of domestic dust. It tells us that the intruder is familiar with the household and moves with cautious precision. This is the fingerprint of intelligence, not accident." I felt a chill as I realized the implications. Our unseen adversary was both clever and deliberate, testing not only the household, but our investigative skills. The tension in the room became almost palpable, a living thing that crept across the floorboards and walls, whispering of unseen eyes and hidden hands. Shortly thereafter, a second, more tangible act of intrusion occurred. The desk, previously untouched, had been shifted by mere inches enough to disturb the arrangement of papers and writing implements. Holmes leaned over the displaced objects with the precision of a surgeon examining a wound. "Watson," he said softly, "observe the disturbance. The alignment of the papers, the angle of displacement. The faint scratches on the surface indicate care and deliberate movement. The intruder wishes us to see and yet not to identify. It is a taunt as much as an act." I wrote down every detail, my hand trembling slightly as I attempted to match Holmes' observations with my own senses. "Holmes," I whispered, "the audacity. This is no longer subtlety, it is provocation." Holmes nodded, though his expression remained impassive. "Precisely, Watson. And it is significant. The intruder escalates gradually, observing reactions and adjusting accordingly. Note the precision. No papers have been lost, no permanent damage has been done, yet the effect upon the mind is considerable. Fear, doubt, and anxiety are as much tools as any lever or device." The night wore on, the fog outside pressing closer against the windows, wrapping the house in a cocoon of muffled silence. Holmes, ever vigilant, continued his observation, moving quietly about the room, testing door hinges and floorboards, examining the subtle interactions of light and shadow. Every small creak, every tremor of the door, every shifting of paper upon the desk, he catalogued with an intensity that made even my own meticulous notes seem crude by comparison. Toward the early hours of morning, the most alarming incident occurred. A soft metallic sound like the turning of a small key emanated from the door's latch. The door, previously closed, began to swing inward, almost imperceptibly at first, then more decisively. Holmes moved swiftly, positioning himself near the door, while I watched, heart pounding. "The device, Watson," he murmured, "is being engaged. Note the sound. It is subtle, mechanical, yet perfectly timed. This is no ordinary tampering, it is the work of someone who understands physics, timing, and the psychology of fear." I dared not breathe, as the door continued to move under the invisible guidance of some unknown hand. Holmes leaned closer, examining the threshold and floorboards, noting the exact points of leverage. "Watson," he whispered finally, "we have confirmation. Our hidden clue is not merely incidental, it is the key to understanding both method and motive. Whoever orchestrates this possesses a mind of cunning, audacity, and patience beyond ordinary measure." As the door finally settled, still and silent, Holmes turned to me with a look that was equal parts triumph and contemplation. "Watson, the events of tonight demonstrate escalation. The intruder grows bolder, yet the methods remain precise. Tomorrow, we must introduce further tests, perhaps traps, to provoke response and narrow the field of suspects. The game has begun in earnest, and the tension will only increase." I retired that morning with both excitement and unease. Knowing that the events of the second night had confirmed the deliberate nature of the disturbances, escalated the mystery, and hinted at an intelligence far beyond ordinary comprehension. The door that closed itself was no longer merely an enigma, it was a message, a challenge, and a warning, all delivered with subtle artistry by an unseen hand. Holmes, ever inscrutable, remained absorbed in contemplation as I left, his eyes distant, yet sharply focused, already tracing the invisible threads of the puzzle. And I, faithful chronicler, could only wonder what revelations the next vigil would bring, and whether the intruder's method and motive would finally be unveiled under the unerring gaze of Sherlock Holmes. Misdirection deepens asterisk. The next day brought with it a pall of gray clouds, through which the feeble light of London struggled, casting long, distorted shadows upon the cobblestone streets. Holmes and I returned to the Faraday residence shortly after breakfast, and I noticed at once a subtle shift in Holmes' demeanor. He appeared more restless than usual, moving about the study with a quickened precision, his eyes darting to every detail, as though anticipating events before they occurred. "Watson," he began, without preamble, "it is time to introduce a measure of misdirection into our observations. The intruder's behavior is deliberate, yet predictable within a narrow frame. We must broaden that frame, observe reactions to unexpected stimuli, and provoke the subtle hand that manipulates this door." I followed his meaning, though with some hesitation. "You intend to trick the intruder?" I asked, trying to reconcile my understanding of Holmes' methods with the situation at hand. Holmes nodded slightly, a sardonic gleam in his eye. "Precisely. Observation alone will not suffice. We must compel the agent of these disturbances to reveal both method and intent. Only then can we progress from conjecture to certainty. And be assured, Watson, subtlety will be our most effective weapon." Our first course of action was to alter the environment in ways that were unobtrusive yet calculated. Holmes adjusted the position of furniture, introduced a small, weighted wedge behind the study door, and even rearranged a few items upon the mantelpiece. These changes were slight, so slight, in fact, that any ordinary observer would not notice, but they were designed to provoke reaction in a mind attuned to subtle manipulation. Holmes' instructions to me were precise. "Observe everything, Watson. Timing, pressure, alignment, even the direction of shadows. Each minute variation may elicit response. The intruder has displayed ingenuity. We must now test both patience and cunning." We settled ourselves in observation, the fire casting wavering light across the room. For several hours, the house remained silent, the fog pressing against the windows like a living shroud. Holmes, as usual, noted the minutest details. A barely perceptible vibration in the floor, the subtle shift of air currents, and the occasional faint creak of the roof timbers. All were catalogued with meticulous care, each observation a potential key to understanding the invisible hand at work. At roughly 10:30, the first sign of response occurred. The study door moved slightly, and I noticed, as Holmes had predicted, that the wedge we had placed produced a subtle resistance. The intruder's manipulation was immediately evident in the angle and force of the movement, an indication that the person was calculating the interference with precision. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glittering. "Observe, Watson. The wedge has been detected. Note the change in timing, the increased deliberation in movement. Our intruder is aware of the alteration and adjusts accordingly. This confirms intelligence, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of the mechanism." Minutes passed in tense observation. Then, a more startling event occurred. The fire in the grate flickered sharply, and the faint outline of a figure appeared behind the study doors, partially ajar panel. I held my breath, for it was the first tangible presence we had glimpsed, though the intruder remained partially obscured, careful to avoid direct detection. Holmes did not move. Instead, he murmured softly, "Observe, Watson. The figure is deliberate in its movements, cautious, yet precise. Note the alignment of hands, the angle of approach, and the pressure upon the floorboards. Each detail confirms what we suspected. The intruder is aware, intelligent, and calculating. Our challenge is to identify motive and identity without provoking premature flight." I scribbled notes feverishly, recording every nuance. The angle of the figure's hands, the soft sound of steps on the polished floor, and the barely audible rustle of clothing against wood. Holmes, meanwhile, examined the door's threshold, noting subtle depressions that corresponded perfectly with the figure's movement. After several minutes, the figure withdrew, leaving behind only a faint smudge on the corner of the doorframe and a sense of heightened tension. Holmes examined the mark with his loupe, murmuring observations under his breath. Watson, observe the residue. Domestic dust mixed with a faint trace of coal soot. The intruder is familiar with the household, has recently passed through the kitchen, and is clever enough to leave minimal evidence. Yet even the cleverest leave traces. Always traces. By midday, the game of misdirection had yielded further insights. Holmes, confident that the intruder had observed our subtle manipulations, began to develop a profile. A mind precise, methodical, and patient, familiar with the household and capable of adapting to changing conditions without error. Yet, he cautioned, these qualities could apply to more than one individual, and misdirection was almost certainly employed to deflect suspicion. In the late afternoon, a more direct misdirection emerged. Miss Eleanor Faraday, concerned about our prolonged presence, entered the study to inquire if everything was proceeding smoothly. Holmes engaged her in casual conversation, observing her gestures, expressions, and reactions to subtle questions about the door's behavior. I noticed a faint flicker of recognition in her eyes as Holmes casually mentioned that we were testing the door's responsiveness to slight interference. Holmes' tone was mild, almost conversational, yet I sensed the underlying strategy. Watson, he whispered after she left, observe how even innocent remarks can provoke thought in those attuned to our investigation. Misdirection need not be elaborate. It often lies in suggestion, in casual remarks, and in the strategic revelation of selective information. Later, as evening descended and fog pressed against the windows once more, the study door shifted unexpectedly. This time, however, the movement was accompanied by a faint metallic clink, followed by the distinct sound of paper being disturbed on the desk. Holmes rose, moving silently toward the door, and I followed with bated breath. Watson, he murmured, crouching beside the threshold, the intruder has responded to our earlier manipulations. Note the sequence. The movement of the door, the sound of metal, and the paper displacement all deliberate, yet intended to mislead. Observe the angle of the hinge, the direction of pressure. These are not random, they are designed to confuse and provoke. Misdirection is the artist's most effective tool. We spent the remainder of the night cataloging the patterns of movement, the subtle pressures, and the sequence of disturbances. Holmes noted with satisfaction that each act of misdirection, each feigned anomaly, could be traced back to deliberate intent, allowing us to begin distinguishing between genuine clues and calculated falsehoods. As dawn approached, Holmes sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers and regarding me with that rare, sardonic smile that hinted at both triumph and caution. Watson, he said softly, our intruder has proven clever, patient, and daring. But even the most subtle hand cannot escape the careful eye of observation. Misdirection deepens the puzzle, yes, but it also reveals character. The cleverest may mislead, yet their intentions are often betrayed by the minutest details. Tomorrow, we shall refine our observations and prepare a test that may compel disclosure. I retired that morning with both anticipation and unease. The intruder's audacity had escalated, and the game of misdirection had proven that we were not merely uncovering mechanical secrets, but engaging with a mind of subtle cunning. Holmes, ever inscrutable, remained absorbed in thought, tracing invisible threads through the fog of the city and the shadowed corridors of the Faraday household. The game had grown more intricate, the stakes higher, and the path to truth more labyrinthine than ever. And I, faithful chronicler, could only hope that the next night's observations would bring us closer to unveiling the unseen hand behind the self-closing door. Holmes' plan that evening, the streets of London were thick with fog, and the chill of early winter had seeped into every crevice of Baker Street. Holmes, unusually restless, paced the sitting room before our departure to the Faraday residence. His mind seemed to be spinning a web far larger than the simple mechanics of a self-closing door, for his gestures, muttered remarks, and rapid calculations suggested a strategy both intricate and daring. Watson, he said at length, halting mid-step, the intruder is clever, patient, and observant, yet he underestimates our capacity to manipulate perception. The previous nights have yielded invaluable insight, but observation alone will not compel disclosure. We must engage in active provocation, controlled, subtle, and calculated. I regarded him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Active provocation, Holmes? You intend to trap him? Holmes gave a faint smile, a mere quirk of the lips, yet one that carried an unmistakable intensity. Trap? Yes, but not in the crude sense of confinement. Rather, we shall craft an environment that forces the intruder to act, revealing method and, if possible, motive. We must become participants in the drama, Watson, rather than passive observers. Upon our arrival at the Faraday residence, Holmes immediately began to execute his plan. He rearranged the study subtly. The door hinges were slightly adjusted, the mantelpiece objects repositioned, and a lightweight cord barely noticeable was affixed to a small object on the desk. Each modification was minute, almost imperceptible, yet designed to provoke a reaction from any person attempting to manipulate the door. "Watson," he whispered, handing me a small notebook, "observe carefully. Note every creak, tremor, shadow, and rustle. Timing is critical. The intruder will respond to changes we have introduced. We must watch, record, and analyze before taking further action. Precision is paramount." The night settled upon us with the weight of anticipation. The fog pressed against the windows, and the distant murmur of the city seemed muted, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Holmes assumed his customary observation post near the fireplace, while I took my place across the room, pen in hand, notebook ready. Hours passed with the solemnity of vigil. The fire cast flickering shadows, and the door remained silent, too silent, I thought, yet Holmes remained impassive, his eyes never leaving the threshold. At precisely 11 o'clock, a subtle vibration passed through the floor, followed by the soft creak of the door moving. It swung inward gently, and I saw the shadow of a figure approach, careful, deliberate, yet aware of unseen observers. Holmes' eyes narrowed, his lips tightening in anticipation. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The intruder has detected the environmental alterations. Note the caution in movement, the precise alignment with floor depressions, and the careful placement of hands upon the door. This is the response we sought, controlled, deliberate, and informative." The figure paused, hands hovering over the desk. It was clear that the cord we had placed was noticed, for the intruder adjusted posture slightly, avoiding direct contact. Holmes, observing this with an intensity that made my own heart pound, whispered, "The reaction confirms intelligence and awareness. The intruder calculates each step, yet even the most careful hand betrays intention. Note the shift in weight, Watson, every action leaves trace." I recorded each movement, the slight tremor of the door, the rustle of clothing, the alignment of hands, and the faint metallic sound of a tool against wood. Holmes, meanwhile, traced the sequence with a mental precision that I could only marvel at. Minutes passed, and the intruder finally withdrew from the desk, returning toward the door. Holmes signaled me to remain silent, his hand raised in the subtle gesture that had become our unspoken communication. The figure reached for the door, applied leverage, and in doing so, disturbed a small weight we had left as a subtle test. The result was immediate, a barely perceptible clink, followed by the shadowy figure freezing momentarily. Holmes' eyes sparkled. "Watson, note that hesitation. It is the confirmation we sought. The intruder is clever, yet even clever minds falter when confronted with the unexpected. Our subtle intervention has produced a reaction. We are observing not merely motion, but intent." The figure paused, glanced toward the window, and then withdrew from the study entirely, leaving only the faintest smudge on the doorframe and a lingering sense of audacity. Holmes rose slowly, inspecting the displaced weight and the cord. "Every detail has spoken, Watson. Timing, pressure, alignment, hesitation, they all reveal method and perhaps the psychological profile of our adversary. He is meticulous, patient, and deeply familiar with the house. Yet even familiarity cannot conceal intention indefinitely." I was struck by Holmes' composure, even as the implications of the night's events weighed upon me. The intruder had acted in predictable ways once provoked, yet the identity remained elusive. Holmes, however, seemed entirely satisfied, as though the night had confirmed both his deductions and his strategy. As we prepared to leave for the night's rest, Holmes turned to me, his gaze penetrating. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall analyze our observations, refine the suspect profile, and consider further interventions. Patience, subtlety, and precision are our allies. The intruder is clever, yes, but the hand of method is inexorable. Every action carries consequence, and every hesitation reveals the mind behind it. I retired that morning with a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. The intruder had demonstrated both daring and intelligence. Yet Holmes' strategic provocation had produced observable reactions, confirmation that method and motive were beginning to emerge from the shadows. As the fog lifted over London, revealing the muted, gaslit streets below, I reflected upon Holmes' approach. Observation alone had proven insufficient. Only by active engagement, subtle manipulation, and carefully crafted misdirection could the unseen hand be compelled to reveal itself. The game had advanced to a new stage, and the stakes were higher than ever. Holmes, seated at the window of Baker Street, steepled his fingers and gazed thoughtfully at the city below. "Watson," he said softly, almost to himself, "the unseen mind is often revealed not through what it touches, but through how it reacts to artifice. The self-closing door is a stage. We are observers, yet also directors. The next act will bring revelation, if we have patience and skill." Thus ended the 8th day of our investigation. The intruder's responses to controlled interventions had confirmed intelligence and method, escalating the tension while providing critical insight. Holmes' strategic plan had begun to yield results, and I, faithful chronicler, could only marvel at his capacity to manipulate both perception and deduction in pursuit of the ultimate truth. The reveal ***. The morning following our strategic vigil at the Faraday residence brought a thin, uncertain sunlight that struggled through the London fog, creating a pallid shimmer over the cobblestones and gas lamps of Bloomsbury. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, laden with notebooks, observations, and the subtle lingering tension of the previous night. I could scarcely keep pace with the whirlwind of his thoughts, for even the mundane sound of the street-distant carriage wheels, the clop of horse hooves seemed to register with him as a component of a larger, intricate puzzle. "Watson," he began as soon as we entered our sitting room, "the events of last night have produced sufficient reactions from our intruder to allow a careful reconstruction of method and, importantly, motive. The evidence is not overwhelming in quantity, yet its quality is profound. Observation, patience, and precision have yielded insight that the untrained eye would miss entirely." I leaned forward, eager and apprehensive. "You mean you are ready to identify the culprit?" Holmes nodded, tapping a forefinger against his temple. "Not only identify, Watson, but to understand. Observe." The intruder's movements were deliberate, careful, and psychologically tuned. His intention was to create fear, to misdirect, and to conceal a more important one that lies at the heart of the Faraday mystery. The door is a stage, the shadows a distraction, and the small mechanical disturbances a calculated measure of our perception. I felt a thrill of anticipation. "And you know who it is?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I know enough to orchestrate disclosure. But as ever, it is the smallest details that betray intention. Consider the following. The wedge we placed, the cord on the desk, and the displacement of papers all produced hesitation. That hesitation is telling. Further, the faint soot upon the window, the residual domestic dust upon the floorboards, and the repeated application of leverage at precise angles reveal a mind accustomed to both observation and subtle mechanics." Holmes moved to the window, drawing the drapery slightly aside to allow the morning light to illuminate the study more fully. "Watson, I believe it is time for confrontation. Our intruder shall be compelled to reveal both identity and method, if we have positioned ourselves correctly." We returned to the Faraday residence that afternoon. Holmes, as usual, maintained an air of casual engagement, interacting with the household in a manner designed to put all at ease, while subtly guiding events toward revelation. He instructed me to observe quietly, take notes, and resist the temptation to interfere, an admonition I accepted with the awareness that in such cases, the finest points of timing were crucial. As the afternoon waned, Holmes positioned objects in the study as before, yet this time with a subtle refinement. Certain implements were replaced in precise alignment with the shadows, the door's threshold was manipulated with almost imperceptible adjustment, and small objects were placed upon the mantelpiece to provoke selective observation. Each alteration was calculated to elicit a reaction without alarming the intruder. At precisely 10 minutes past 7, the first movement occurred. The study door shifted ever so slightly, as if nudged by invisible hands. Holmes, crouched by the hearth, murmured softly, "Observe, Watson. The intruder has detected our alterations. Note the alignment of pressure upon the floorboards, the hesitation in posture, and the controlled angle of engagement with the door. These are the fingerprints of intent." Moments later, a figure appeared, partially obscured by shadow. It moved cautiously, its hands hovering near the objects on the desk, eyes scanning the room as though measuring every detail. Holmes remained impassive, yet I could sense the intensity in the air. This was the moment we had been orchestrating for days. The figure reached for the door, applying leverage at a precise angle. The movement triggered a subtle, prearranged response. A small object tipped from the mantelpiece with a gentle clatter. The figure froze instantly, the slight disturbance providing the confirmation Holmes sought. "Observe Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. "The hesitation is key. The intruder's intention is revealed not by what he touches, but by how he reacts to unexpected variables. Note the shift in weight, the subtle recoil of the hands and the slight tremor in movement. This is method and psychology intertwined." Holmes rose slowly and addressed the intruder in a calm, measured voice. "You have demonstrated intelligence, patience, and daring, yet you underestimate the observant mind. Step forward and reveal yourself, for your method has betrayed you." The figure, a man of wiry build with eyes sharp and calculating, stepped into the light. Recognition came suddenly. I knew him from prior interactions with the household, though I had never suspected him of such audacity. It was Mr. Samuel Henshaw, the gardener we had previously observed, yet his demeanor now revealed an entirely new dimension. A mixture of guilt, pride, and defiance. Holmes advanced, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Henshaw, you have engaged in a series of deliberate acts designed to manipulate perception, create fear, and distract attention from a more subtle objective. Explain, if you will, your method and motive." Henshaw hesitated, then spoke in a low, controlled voice. I never intended harm, sir. The disturbances, I was ordered to test security, to ensure certain items within the study were protected. I followed instructions, nothing more. I did not anticipate observation, nor did I foresee the attention it would attract." Holmes' expression remained impassive, yet his eyes were sharp with calculation. "Who, then, ordered you? What items required such subtle protection?" Henshaw's gaze flickered, betraying momentary hesitation. "I cannot disclose the names, sir. My instructions were confidential. Only that the items are of great value and delicate significance." Holmes nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "Very well. Let us examine the physical evidence." He directed my attention to the subtle depressions in the floorboards, the marks upon the door, and the smudges upon the windowsill. Each item, he explained, corresponded perfectly with the intruder's movements, confirming both method and sequence. "The door," Holmes continued, "was never the objective. It was the stage upon which a diversion was enacted, designed to mask the manipulation of other objects that are now secure, yet whose significance remains partially hidden from our view. The intruder acted with precision, yet the psychological profile, fear, hesitation, calculation betrays both motive and allegiance. I noted every word, realizing that the revelation was as much about psychology as mechanics. Henshaw, far from being merely a gardener, had been a willing agent in a deliberate scheme, yet one bound by secrecy and partial obedience. Holmes' methodical reconstruction had unveiled the chain of events and the interplay of intellect, deception, and subtlety that had governed the self-closing door. Finally, Holmes addressed Henshaw directly. "Your actions have revealed intention, skill, and familiarity. Yet the ultimate truth lies in the mind that orchestrated the orders you followed. You, Mr. Henshaw, have served as instrument. The originator remains at large. Our investigation, however, now allows us to constrain both method and motive, narrowing the path to disclosure." As Henshaw was led away under careful supervision, I felt both satisfaction and relief. The mystery, which had seemed impenetrable, was now illuminated by methodical observation, strategic provocation, and the unerring logic of Sherlock Holmes. The door that had closed itself was no longer a phantom. It was a deliberate instrument of distraction, a testament to human cunning, and a stage for a subtle psychological game. Holmes, as ever, remained quietly contemplative, tracing invisible threads in the air with his eyes. "Watson," he said at last, "we have seen that the smallest, most deliberate action can yield profound insight. Observation, patience, and subtle intervention have unveiled the method behind mystery. Yet human intention is often layered, and motives remain partially obscured. There is always another layer, another thread to follow." And so concluded the pivotal revelation. The method, the subtlety, and the psychological framework had been laid bare. Yet, as Holmes' final words reminded me, the full measure of human motive and deception is rarely fully understood in a single unveiling. Aftermath and outro ***. The morning following Mr. Henshaw's revelation was crisp and clear, the London fog finally lifting to reveal streets damp but sparkling under the weak sunlight. I walked beside Holmes through the quiet avenues, still reeling from the events of the previous evening. The intrigue of the self-closing door had yielded both method and partial motive, yet the human consequences of the affair weighed heavily upon my mind. Holmes, however, appeared entirely composed, as though the intricacies of human behavior were merely another set of calculations to be catalogued and understood. "Watson," he remarked, "the fascination lies not merely in the mechanical or the observable, but in the interplay of intellects. Observe how the human mind, even when constrained by instruction or obligation, must inevitably reveal itself in subtle patterns." I reflected upon Henshaw, the wiry gardener whose careful obedience had nearly convinced the household of his guilt. He had been an instrument, a participant in a game whose rules he only partially understood. Yet the layers of deception, subtle manipulation, and psychological provocation revealed a clever and morally ambiguous mind at work behind the scenes. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes seated himself at his usual spot by the fireplace, steepling his fingers, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. I, meanwhile, placed my notes upon the table, attempting to bring order to the events that had unfolded with such precision and yet such uncertainty. "Holmes," I ventured, "the matter seems resolved in terms of immediate action, yet I cannot help but wonder, what of the ultimate motive, the originator of Henshaw's orders? There remains a shadow over this affair." Holmes inclined his head thoughtfully. "Indeed, Watson. The orchestration behind Henshaw's activity remains partly hidden, but our work has narrowed the field considerably. The method is now understood, and the immediate threat contained. The unseen hand, for the time being, may remain in obscurity, yet the patterns established are sufficient to prevent further incidents." I noted a faint smile cross his lips. "And what of the Faradays? Will they remain secure now?" Holmes' gaze met mine, cool yet penetrating. "Security, Watson, is as much a matter of perception as of locks or levers. The household may now rest assured that their intruder has been identified and restrained. Yet human curiosity and mischief are ever persistent. It is the understanding of method, vigilance, and preparation that ensures true security." Over the next several days, I visited the Faraday residence to ensure that Mr. Henshaw had been dealt with appropriately, and that no residual anxiety remained in the household. Miss Eleanor Faraday greeted me warmly, though with a hint of lingering trepidation. She spoke in soft tones of the relief she felt that the self-closing door, once a source of fear and mystery, had been revealed as a controlled and deliberate phenomenon. "The house feels lighter somehow," she said quietly, "yet I cannot forget the moments of unease, when shadows seemed alive, and the door moved as though by some unseen will." I nodded, understanding perfectly. The psychological impact of the intruder's manipulations had been profound, and only the knowledge of method and consequence could restore peace of mind. Back at Baker Street, Holmes and I reflected upon the events with our usual mixture of analytic rigor and quiet contemplation. "Watson," he said, "this case illustrates the delicate balance between observation, intervention, and deduction. The smallest, most subtle evidence, if interpreted correctly, can reveal not only method but also intent. Our adversary relied on distraction and misdirection, yet ultimately, consistency and logic prevail over cunning and artifice. I considered the moral complexity of the affair. Henshaw had been obedient yet culpable. In a limited sense, his orders had come from an unknown authority, whose motives remained partly obscured. Holmes' ability to navigate the interplay of mechanical manipulation, psychological subtlety, and human frailty was remarkable. Yet I felt a lingering unease at the layers of secrecy and subterfuge that remained partially unresolved. Holmes, ever the philosopher when the immediate danger has passed, spoke quietly as he traced the outline of the fireplace with his eyes. "Human actions are rarely simple, Watson. Obedience, fear, curiosity, and intelligence intertwine in ways that produce outcomes both surprising and instructive. One must never underestimate the capacity for deception, nor the human tendency to reveal truth through subtle, involuntary acts." As the days progressed, I chronicled the case in meticulous detail, noting each observation, sequence of events, and subtle clue. The interplay of method, manipulation, and misdirection provided a rich narrative, yet Holmes' reflections reminded me that even the most complete account cannot fully encompass the complexities of human behavior. Finally, one evening, Holmes rose and looked out over the gaslit streets of London, the fog once again curling along the avenues and alleyways. "Watson," he said, his voice measured and calm, "the game has concluded, at least for now. The immediate danger is removed, the intruder identified and constrained, and the household secure. Yet let us remember that vigilance, patience, and careful observation are eternal companions to reason and intellect. The mysteries of human action are endless. Our work, though completed here, continues wherever logic confronts obscurity." I watched him in admiration, noting the quiet satisfaction that came from both resolution and understanding. Holmes, master of observation, deduction, and subtle strategy, had once again revealed the intricate machinery of human intent. The self-closing door, once a source of fear and bewilderment, now stood as a testament to method, misdirection, and the triumph of reason over artifice. That night, as I retired to my own lodgings, I reflected upon the lessons of the case. The power of subtlety, the importance of patience, and the need to observe both action and reaction. Holmes' genius lay not merely in his ability to deduce, but in his understanding of the interplay between perception, psychology, and human behavior. The self-closing door had closed, yet its legacy of insight, intrigue, and intellectual triumph remained indelibly marked upon my memory. And in the quiet hours of London's early dawn, as the city stirred beneath the fog and gaslight, I understood once more why I had devoted myself to chronicling the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. For in every mystery, every subtle clue, and every shadowed corridor of thought, there lay a challenge worthy of his extraordinary mind and an education for those willing to observe, reflect, and learn. Reflections and Residual Shadows ***. The days following the resolution of the Faraday case were unusually still at Baker Street. London, beneath a pale and reluctant sun, seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, as though the city itself had sensed the unraveling of a subtle and calculated mystery. Holmes, however, never truly rested. He spent his mornings examining odds and ends of scientific instruments, his evenings lost in observation of minute details that most men would dismiss as irrelevant. I, for my part, devoted myself to the task of recording the events of the Faraday affair in painstaking detail. The case of the self-closing door had proved, above all, that even the most innocuous of household features could conceal a labyrinth of psychological intrigue and human cunning. Yet, as I wrote, I was acutely aware of the residual tension that lingered not merely in the Faraday household, but in the subtleties of human behavior itself. Holmes occasionally interrupted my writing, his thoughts straying to details I would not have noticed. "Watson," he said one afternoon, examining a small set of hinges from the Faraday study, "observe the pattern of wear. Not merely the mechanical function, but the sequence of usage. Every repeated action leaves a subtle trace. The intruder's hand was precise, but repetition reveals character, and character yields understanding." I glanced up, notebook poised. So even in the smallest actions, a mind can be read. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. The ordinary observer sees only motion. The trained eye sees intention, deliberation, and personality encoded in minute behaviors. Henshaw, for example, acted with deliberate care, yet his adherence to instruction left patterns that exposed both his abilities and his constraints. Observe closely, and one sees the mind behind the hand." That evening, I accompanied Holmes to the Faraday residence once more, not for investigation, but for courtesy and reassurance. The household greeted us warmly, though an undercurrent of lingering tension remained. Miss Eleanor Faraday, still pale from weeks of anxious nights, admitted with faint embarrassment that she found herself watching every door, anticipating movement that might never come. Holmes, in his customary fashion, offered reassurance both gentle and logical. "Miss Faraday," he said, "the door's actions were entirely accounted for. No force, human or otherwise, remains unobserved. The disturbances were deliberate, methodical, and, crucially, constrained. You may return to a sense of normalcy with confidence." Fear, after all, is often more persistent than the source that provoked it. Yet as we walked the streets back to Baker Street, I could not help but reflect upon the lingering psychological impact of the affair. The notion that the familiar, the ordinary, could conceal such intricate schemes weighed upon me. I found myself glancing at shadows, listening for subtle creaks, and imagining the traces that might reveal human intention. Holmes, observing my unease, seemed mildly amused. "Watson," he remarked quietly, "the mind, once trained to detect subtlety, finds patterns in the world even where none were intended. That is both a blessing and a burden. The case is concluded, yet the lessons remain. Observation, patience, and the understanding of human intent are never dormant. They continue to shape perception long after a single mystery is solved. In the quiet hours of Baker Street, Holmes and I often reviewed the events of the case, seeking patterns that might have eluded even the master's immediate notice. We examined the sequence of disturbances, the psychological interplay between intruder and household, and the methods by which subtle manipulation revealed both skill and intent. Each discussion reinforced the extraordinary precision with which Holmes had orchestrated the resolution, yet also reminded me that human behavior was infinitely more complex than mechanical patterns alone. One morning, as Holmes examined a small set of mechanical levers and pulleys I had brought from the Faraday study, he spoke with unusual solemnity. "Watson, the ultimate lesson here is the interplay between observation and action. Methodical attention to detail allows one to reconstruct even the most subtle manipulations. Yet the human element, motivation, fear, and hesitation cannot be wholly quantified. The genius lies in understanding both." I nodded, though I felt a lingering sense of awe. Holmes' ability to parse both the mechanical and the psychological had transformed what might have seemed a simple trick of a self-closing door into a study of human cunning and fear. The intruder, clever and deliberate though he was, had nonetheless revealed himself to the unerring observation of Sherlock Holmes. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a semblance of ordinary routine. Henshaw was quietly removed from the household, and the Faradays took steps to reinforce the security of their study. Yet the subtle echoes of the affair lingered in my memory. I found myself pondering not only the events themselves, but also the extraordinary methods by which a brilliant mind like Holmes could extract truth from shadows, hesitation, and the smallest of mechanical traces. Holmes, ever modest, rarely spoke of the genius with which he had resolved the affair. Yet in his quiet moments I saw the satisfaction of a mind perfectly exercised, a puzzle fully unraveled, and a sense of justice quietly restored. It was not the thrill of danger or confrontation that inspired him, but the perfect alignment of observation, deduction, and subtle intervention. One evening, as I prepared my notes for final submission to our ongoing chronicles, Holmes turned to me and said, almost casually, "Watson, it is important to remember that not every mystery is wholly solved in the public sense. Some truths remain partly obscured, their revelation dependent upon further observation or circumstance. The Faraday case is concluded, yet its lessons endure in the subtleties of human perception." I closed my notebook, reflecting upon the journey from the initial baffling disturbances to the ultimate resolution. The self-closing door, once a source of fear and bewilderment, had been transformed into a testament to method, misdirection, and the extraordinary power of observation. The intruder, while clever and cunning, had ultimately been revealed by the most subtle signs, and the household restored to security and calm. And as London settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Holmes resumed his study by the fireplace, eyes fixed upon the faintly flickering flames. I watched him, recording each moment, aware that in every shadow, every hesitation, and every subtle trace of human action lay the potential for revelation. The case of the self-closing door had ended, yet its lessons of patience, precision, and the relentless pursuit of truth remained indelibly etched upon both our minds. Closure and contemplation ***. The early days of December brought with them a crisp clarity to the London air. A welcome relief from the persistent fog that had so often obscured the streets of our city during the investigations at the Faraday residence. Baker Street, though quieter than usual, seemed to hold an air of anticipation, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension of the previous weeks and now awaited the satisfaction of closure. Holmes and I resumed our routine. Holmes engaged with chemical experiments at his table, examining reagents and measuring minute quantities with the precision of a surgeon, while I dedicated myself to finalizing the detailed account of the Faraday affair. Yet despite the apparent calm, there remained a residual sense of unease, a subtle acknowledgement that human cunning and the capacity for misdirection are never entirely dormant. Our reflections that morning were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Eleanor Faraday herself. She entered the flat with the elegance and quiet dignity characteristic of her household, yet I could discern the traces of lingering anxiety in her expression. Holmes, observing her with his customary intensity, rose and offered the polite bow of acknowledgement that I have long considered the most subtle mark of his Victorian decorum. "Miss Faraday," he said softly, "I trust the household has returned to its customary tranquility?" She nodded, yet the faint tremor in her voice betrayed the persistence of memory. "We are safer, Mr. Holmes," she admitted, "and yet the events, they leave one wary. Every door, every shadow, seems imbued with a new significance. Holmes inclined his head. That is understandable. Fear, once introduced, leaves traces not so easily erased. Yet knowledge, observation, and reason remain the most effective antidotes. The method, as you will recall, has been revealed. The intruder constrained, and no further disturbances need be feared. Her eyes met mine with gratitude, and I felt the satisfaction that accompanies the completion of a case not merely solved but understood. It is one thing to restore order, to restore the confidence and composure of those whose lives have been unsettled by subtle and persistent misdirection. After her departure, Holmes and I returned to our sitting room, the silence of Baker Street embracing us. I could not resist the impulse to question him on the final nuances of the case. "Holmes," I asked, "Henshaw acted under instruction. Yet the originator of the orders remains unknown. Do you expect we shall ever discover who orchestrated the events?" Holmes' eyes glimmered with that rare mixture of intensity and calm. "Possibly, Watson, though it matters less than one might assume. The genius of an unseen hand lies not only in its capacity for concealment, but also in its inadvertent revelation through patterns, hesitation, and residual traces. Henshaw, while obedient, revealed enough to illuminate method, and method is often sufficient to prevent repetition or further harm. Complete knowledge, though desirable, is rarely necessary for effective resolution." I reflected upon this. It was one of Holmes' recurring lessons. The mastery of observation and deduction can often render partial knowledge as effective as full disclosure. One need not pierce every shadow to restore order. One need only trace patterns, anticipate consequences, and apply logic with precision. Later that afternoon, Holmes indulged in a rare moment of explanation, though framed in his usual enigmatic style. "Consider the self-closing door, Watson," he said, gesturing toward the hearth, as if the very air carried his meaning. It was never the heart of the mystery. It was a stage upon which subtle manipulations, psychological provocation, and deliberate misdirection were enacted. The true essence lies in the unseen mind that orchestrated these events, a mind attentive to human tendencies and the smallest mechanical detail. Our work has revealed method, sequence, and response, the essence of understanding. I took careful notes, for I knew these reflections would serve as invaluable guidance for future observation and documentation. Holmes, in his relentless pursuit of logic, had transformed what might have seemed a trivial mechanical curiosity into a profound lesson on human behavior, the psychology of misdirection, and the power of meticulous deduction. As evening fell, a soft snow began to drift against the windows of Baker Street, delicate flakes catching the lamplight in a quiet, magical display. Holmes gazed out at the streets below, the stillness of the city contrasting sharply with the turbulence of the past weeks. I watched him, noting the rare serenity that accompanied the satisfaction of a case both solved and understood. "Watson," he said finally, his voice low and contemplative, "the fascination of a case lies not solely in the unveiling of culprits or the restoration of order. It lies in the mastery of observation, the subtle comprehension of intention, and the patient assembly of evidence. We confront not merely the act, but the mind behind the act. That is where true deduction resides." I nodded, feeling the familiar awe of witnessing Holmes' genius at its quietest and most profound. The self-closing door, the disturbances, the calculated hesitations, all had been unveiled, yet their lessons remained: subtlety, precision, and the inexorable triumph of reason over artifice. Before retiring that night, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile, his expression almost human in its warmth, a rare concession amidst his usual impenetrable intensity. "Watson, chronicling these cases is not merely an exercise in record-keeping. It is an extension of observation itself, a refinement of the mind through reflection. Each narrative preserves both method and insight, ensuring that future minds may benefit from the subtleties of deduction." I closed my notebook, reflecting on the entire affair. From the initial disturbances to the subtle psychological games, the strategic interventions, and the ultimate revelation. The case had tested patience, intellect, and perception, and its resolution had affirmed the extraordinary capabilities of Sherlock Holmes. In the quiet hours of night, as the snow fell softly upon London, I understood once more why I had devoted myself to chronicling the adventures of my extraordinary friend. For in every mystery, every carefully concealed clue, and every subtle trace of human behavior, there lay a challenge worthy of his genius and a lesson in logic, observation, and the enduring pursuit of truth. Holmes, seated by the fire, remained absorbed in thought, the flickering flames reflecting in his keen eyes. The case of the self-closing door was complete, yet in its completion lay a broader truth. that human ingenuity, whether employed for mischief or malice, invariably leaves a trail visible to those with patience, acuity, and the courage to observe. Thus ended the episode of the self-closing door, a mystery that had tested nerves, intellect, and perception. The intruder was revealed, the household restored, and the lessons indelibly etched upon our minds. Yet the city outside remained a labyrinth of shadows, opportunities for misdirection, and subtle human intrigue, awaiting the vigilance of a mind trained to discern the invisible threads of intention. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew, with quiet certainty, that no door, no matter how subtly manipulated, could remain closed to the perception of Sherlock Holmes.